I am a grateful believer in Jesus, and I'm in recovery for codependency, food addiction, and trauma from domestic violence. My name is Sharon.
Hi, Sharon.
My name is Rich. I'm a faithful believer in Jesus Christ in recovery for drug addiction, alcoholism, and I mean pretty much everything that's on the tile up there.
Hi, Rich.
Hey, Rich.
So we're going to do something that we've never done before, and I'm going to kind of interview Rich for his testimony tonight. I wish I could take credit for this great idea, but there was one evening we were standing in the back, and Brad asked a question, and he goes, "You know, Rich, I've heard your story, but I really want to know how somebody goes from an agnostic to leading a Christian recovery group." So tonight we're going to kind of go through Rich's story to find out, how do you go from being an agnostic to being called to a church through tragedy to now leading others in recovery through a Christ-centered 12-step recovery program. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. If you could give your sobriety/life testimony a title, what would it be and why?
Let's go.
It's a Christ-centered program, so I'm going to keep this clean. I would probably say failing forward. I failed so many times in my life for the first 30 years of my life, I can't even keep track of them. But I do know, looking back on it, I've heard people talk about you either win or you have lessons. And I think all the times that I was told I wasn't good enough, all the times that I was told I wouldn't amount to anything, in the back of my mind, I think I had belief in myself, even though I had a lot of false pride. And I do believe that when the time came and I actually was able to put negative manipulation into positive action, that things started to turn around for me very quickly. And even at, we'll get into it, the God I didn't believe in, I blamed for all my problems, which is kind of ironic. But I would say failing forward. I've failed forward for the last 49 years of my life. So,
When do you think addiction truly took over your life?
it was probably, really my whole life. But I think it started when I was probably in my early teens or even before that. I get to, talking to some people this evening, and it brought back some memories. So, I grew up without a lot of means. My parents sent us to a Catholic school because they believed in a faith-based education. Rest in peace, I love my parents. I lost them both over the last 3 years. But when you're the poor kids from the south side of Newark and you're checking into the private school, it's hard to tell people, it's hard to say we were impoverished when we were going to a private school, but we were. And funny story, I remember when I was 10 years old, and my mom had a Renault. I don't know if you guys know what a Renault is. Yeah, Brad knows, he probably had one. I mean, yeah, they make F1 cars. I mean, Renault is a world-renowned vehicle, but a Le Car wasn't a world-renowned car. And my mom would drop me off at St. Francis in a car that literally said Le Car on the side of it. And I remember getting in a fight one day because one of these kids came up to me and said, "Hey, could I borrow a Le Pen?" Because kids are mean. And so I think I punched him, got in trouble for it. But I think that's when addiction took over my life, because I started looking for coping mechanisms when I was 10 years old. Because nobody likes to feel less than. And I would have to say it's when it started.
At what age do you first remember using?
13. Yeah, my parents let me stay at my brother's fraternity house when he played college football when I was 13 years old. Now, I used to always say, I don't want my parents to hear my testimony or my AA lead, because I've given my AA lead 100 times. And they never did, but they're in heaven looking down right now, so they're hearing this for sure. But yeah, what parents allow a 13-year-old kid to stay at a football fraternity house after a Saturday college football game? My parents. I saw things that probably started me off into a pattern of trying to find excitement in my life from the age of 13 on. So yeah, that's when it all began.
Do you feel like there was a specific moment or an event that happened in your life that is what led you down the road of addiction?
The moment that put me in addiction? I mean, what took it to different level was when I got drunk, passed out behind the wheel of a car and hit a tree. Was life flighted, coded twice on the way to the hospital in a med flight. That's when it really took a turn for the worse, because that was when I met real hard opiate drugs. I ended up being diagnosed with avascular necrosis, which, I mean, I'm gonna give my age up here, but anybody that was a sports fan when I was a kid knew who Bo Jackson was. And Bo Jackson's career ended because he ended up with avascular necrosis, which is a degenerative disease where your bone dies. The only way to fix that is to replace your hip, which I had 9 years ago. But when I was 21 years old, the only way to do it was to feed you drugs. So my replacement doctor informed me that my insurance company wouldn't pay to replace a hip in a 21-year-old, that they would have to give me 3 or 4 of them throughout my life. So they started giving me 100 Percocet with 6 refills. So that's where it began, really.
What was the defining moment in your life that was your wake-up call to get sober, and what did that time in your life look like?
Well, it was March 11, 2006. The only reason I remember that date, it was the day before my ultimate sobriety date. But it was the first time in my life that I made the decision to take my life. And I wasn't like looking for attention, so nobody knew. Even my wife thought I went to work, which I did. But I ended up in a seedy motel on the north end of Columbus with a 5th of grain alcohol I drank in less than 10 minutes. Because I was too big of a wimp to stick a gun in my mouth. But when you make that decision, to make a permanent decision like that, when I woke up the next day, I wish at the time I didn't, obviously, but I was given some good counsel by an intervention specialist the following day, but I think it was really the day I woke up when I actually tried to take my life. I realized that there was a reason, and I was going to try to find it.
How many attempts or relapses did you have before you finally got sober, and what did those look like?
So I had multiple relapses from 2002 or 3 till like 2004, but I do have 3 one-year coins in AA. So on day 364, I gave my AA lead which I wasn't supposed to, but my sponsor was the secretary of the meeting. So I gave you're supposed to wait a year, but on day 364, I gave my lead. And when I woke up on day 365 and there wasn't a parade, I decided to throw my own and celebrate. So I relapsed on the 1-year anniversary of my sobriety. The following year, I had 367 days. And I forced a fight with my wife so I could go relapse and do whatever I wanted, because again, I guess maybe I didn't think I had a problem. But that time is when it was days later after that I was going to commit suicide. And I gotta be honest, I've been chasing, it's gonna sound terrible, I have been chasing the feeling for 20 years to what it felt like to wake up the day I'd made a decision to take my own life. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the next day. Like, I didn't care if I had money. I didn't care if I was going to get in trouble. I didn't care if I was going to let people down. I know it sounds really sick to say that you chase that feeling, but recovery for me has never been perfect. It's been a process. So you don't ever, like, I'm sorry, I'm never going to be cured. And I know that isn't sometimes isn't a popular statement, especially in the rooms of Celebrate Recovery. But I'm given a set of tools through recovery and belief that I can deal with those issues on a daily basis. So.
You said earlier you became sober as an agnostic. Looking back over your life, specifically when leading up to your addiction, and then in the many years of your sobriety, living as an agnostic, looking back now, can you see where God was at work in your life even before you knew that He was the one working in your life?
Yeah, I am going to start. If you guys aren't familiar in the recovery world, I remember going to my first AA meeting high. I mean, I had to go. My rehab was making me get a paper signed, but I was going to trick the system. And I remember walking into that meeting, and I remember if they said God once, they said it 1,000 times. And I was very uncomfortable. I actually was going to leave that meeting, and I was never going to come back. Because like I said again, I blamed all my problems on the God I didn't believe in. And what ended up becoming my first sponsor, one of the most important people in my life, he came up to me after the meeting and he said, "Do you know what chapter 4 of the big book is?" I didn't know what a big book was. So he went and got me the big book, and the big book is, chapter 4 is We the Agnostics. And I remember reading this: "To the one who feels he is an atheist or an agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easier alternatives to face. So I do know when that guy handed me that book that day, if that wasn't the first intervention by God in my life, it was probably one of the most important. Because if he wouldn't have done that, I'd probably be dead. Because I would have never walked back in that room. Because again, it made me extremely uncomfortable to hear God can do this, God can do this. And I gotta tell you what, the Bible leads the most people in mankind to our Savior, Jesus Christ. But the second book that leads the most people is the big book of AA. And if you don't believe it, go to one of the meetings. Steve, what do you think? You've been to AA meetings. There is a huge, even though they talk about it as being a higher power in AA, you go to the right meetings and you hear the word Jesus all the time, so much that it makes you uncomfortable. So I don't know if I answered the question right,
It's your testimony,
but
not mine.
I'm just spitballing.
All right. This one I get to kind of make a little bit of fun of you, which always excites me. How did you go from being an agnostic to being set up on a blind date by your dad with a pastor, to coming to a church, getting excited about thinking the communion up front was brownies at church, to becoming a Bible reading, daily praying leader of a Christian recovery group?
Tragedy. That's what it was. So I'm going to say I have, because his spirit will live forever. I have a nephew that passed away in a car accident on February 4th of 2021, so tomorrow. And the kid had religious grit. He made me extremely uncomfortable. We had a fun, charismatic type relationship, just because, I'm not gonna lie, I'm the coolest uncle. I'm the youngest of all of them, you know. And when he died in a car accident after praising God openly as like a 7 and 8 year old, I wanted to know he was in a better place. I was in a really dark place, just because I took my nephews, his brothers, to a Cavs game just to try to distract them. And we drove up 13 to go to the basketball game. And we passed St. Joseph's Cemetery, where Brady's buried. And you know, you're 10 minutes into a 2-hour trip, and I spent the entire 2 hours on the way there obsessing about the fact that that little boy was buried in a cold, dark hole, and there was nothing other than that. And there were people in my life and God working to try to help me to understand that there was something better. So my parents' neighbor was a pastor. My brother set up a meeting. I had no idea he was a pastor. I was terribly angry when I found out he was a pastor. But he humanized faith for me for the first time, like in my life. I was used to getting virtue signaled by priests that were doing unthinkable things behind closed doors, telling me I was a terrible individual, punishing me by having to skip I lost so many recesses as a kid. I think I probably copied the Bible 4 or 5 times, because the punishment was you missed recess and you had to go in there and you had to write the Bible. But I met him, he helped me, I came to church very soon after that, very apprehensive. But I started feeling God moving in my life at that point. Then when I lost my father, who started dying of a broken heart the day my nephew died. I'll never forget the sounds my father made. It's not something I ever want to hear again, and it's not something that you can emulate. But the pain, I decided that I would start going to Celebrate Recovery, because I'd been in AA for a very long time, and I started to see things in my life start to change. My self-seeking in my life started to slip away, and I didn't understand. I knew what was going on, but I was a little bit hesitant. But I went through, did the steps of CR. We relaunched this meeting, and the day before we started the CR meeting, I went to St. Francis, where he went to school, and I lit a candle, and I promised that little boy that there would be nothing that would ever stop me in my life to bring people to Jesus Christ in recovery in his honor. It's the only way, other than to put a tattoo on my arm, I knew how to keep his spirit alive for the rest of my life. I was even fired as the CR leader here, because I probably deserved it, but personalities took over for process. And I remember, thank God for this meeting, Steve kept the meeting going. But when I came back, I said, I didn't want to lead the meeting again. I really didn't. But I didn't come to the meeting for weeks, and that wasn't because I didn't want to be here. It was because I didn't want to make the people here uncomfortable. But as soon as it didn't feel uncomfortable, I was going to come back here because I'm gonna lead people in Jesus Christ recovery until I die in His honor. And that's really.
Anyone who gets the honor to know both you and your wife Amy knows that Amy is an absolute godsend and spent years praying over you when I'm sure that that's the last thing that you wanted anybody to do. What did life with Amy look like when you guys were together in your midst of your addiction and sobriety before God? And what does your life together look like now that you're walking in sobriety with God?
Well, when I was using, it was a show. Because, you know, I was a liar. I lied almost every day, not for the reasons most people think you would lie. I lied to protect my addiction. But we wanted to be married. I give her a lot of credit. She's in a different ministry tonight. I really wish she could have been here. I really wish she could have been sitting up here because, to be honest, this is as much her story as it is mine. But early on, recovery is a very selfish program. And if you've ever been in it, you know that it's got to be really hard for your loved ones who, you know, essentially an addict or we're clinical narcissists. Everything's about us. And then you get into recovery and everything's about us. And the fact that she was able to stand by my side and do that, even with, you know, what was going on, but I know that she believed in me. She had a really good friend that she worked in the medical field, and she had a really good friend that is a good friend of ours to this day. And I remember her telling my wife, like, when I relapsed again, do you realize this is probably going to be your life? And that was a tough thing to hear. But she didn't trust a word I said for the first 3 years I got sober. Which, look, I earned that seat at the table. I hear all the time people going, man, I got sober. My wife doesn't believe me. It was like, man, it took me 3 years for her to believe anything I said. But we stayed together because we wanted to be married. She has always been a faithful person. I know she prayed for all those years that I would find, not God at the time, but I would just find success, or I would just find recovery. So when I got on a faith journey, our life has changed a lot. I'm ornery, man. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I am. I'm not a textbook Christian. But being wholehearted, in my opinion, in what we try to live in our life, being wholehearted isn't making mistakes or not making mistakes. It isn't perfection, it's progress. Our life looks a lot different today because we used to get mad at each other and it would last for days. It's not the case anymore, because we do believe that God is working in our lives, and we use serving God as a freedom in our life. So service to others is always a freedom in this program. That's why the 12 steps of any recovery program, the 12 steps is to carry the message to those still suffering. They don't do that because they want you to go on tour. They do it, and they built the program of CR and AA and all these programs. They build it because they know if you serve others, you got to give it away to keep it. And if you do that, like I will walk through 10 miles of glass to try to help somebody that wants help. Again, people have to want help. Like there were a lot of people that tried to help me when I didn't want help and it was worthless. But as soon as I made the decision that I wanted help, as soon as I see anybody that shows up in this room and works the first step, I'll do anything I can for those people. Why? Because the program of recovery saved my life. Jesus Christ saved my life. Over and over and over again. I mean, that was another thing, I'm going to ramble for a second here. That was another thing that was so tough for me when my nephew died. My wife had stage 4 cancer. She was going through a series of surgeries. I knew she was going to die. And I'm not so sure she did too. And at the time, Brady was very young. This was like 2016, so he would have been 6 or 7 years old. And we would have all the kids out to the house, and because we were landlocked, she was going through treatments and all this. So we would have kids out to the house, and my parents would come out, my brothers and sisters would come out, and we would all try to surround her with love, right? And we had a pool out there, and the kids, man, they're doing cannonballs, breaking stuff. And this 7-year-old kid would start every time he came out there on one knee in front of my wife praying for her. It just, I don't know, it's hard to explain. And when I say I'm going to ramble, it takes it all back to when I knew that I could affect people's lives and change people's life in His honor, that someday, like, we would have the opportunity to tell a story like this. So I think I lost my train of thought, which is I got early onset dementia.
For the newcomer, or those just stepping into their recovery, or those with multiple years of recovery, what advice do you have for them?
It's not going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile is easy. You hear all the sayings in recovery, day at a time. Got to give it away to keep it. Hope's found here. All those things that I thought were super cheesy when I first walked into a room of recovery. The principles that we read up here, just fail forward. Because I got to tell you, if I can get sober, and the Lord could save me, I'm telling you, He could save anyone. Because if you would have met me in 2003, boy, I could light up a room. But it wasn't the way you thought I could. I'm just glad that, look, kids, if you've got kids, if you've disappointed people, there is no permanent solution for a temporary problem. I tried it, I woke up, but look, the biggest advice is get a sponsor, pick up people in recovery, like get accountability partners, put people in your life that will hold you accountable, but also will just check in on you, and I'll end with this. My father, very smart guy. He was an engineer by trade. But I remember when I went to football camp my freshman year of college, I was going in like late June, and I was an 18-year-old kid. And my dad was like, hey, I want to sit down and have a talk. And it was like, okay. And he said to me, I'm going to give you some hard truths. And he told me that you probably won't meet 5 people the rest of your life that you don't know now that you can call a true friend. And I believed that. And I believed that for the next 9 years of my life. So I was always on guard. But I will be honest with you, the best people I've ever met in my life have been in recovery. And they're there because we give experience, strength, and hope. So if you're struggling, look, find somebody to talk to. Be open-minded. There's power in vulnerability. Because most of the time, like even if you go to a meeting, come to a meeting, don't have to say anything. Like you don't have to say anything when you come into a meeting like this. But if you're struggling, before you give up, find some people around you that have dealt with the same things. You're not going to go to a car mechanic and ask them how to cook a burger. You're going to go to somebody that's fixed cars. You come to these rooms, you find people like that. But before you decide to make some of the decisions I made, if you're struggling to that point, come talk to me. Pick somebody in the room. Show up to a meeting. Steve has a joke that you always hear meeting makers make it. And he always said, if you only go to one meeting a week, don't cut back. So if you're really struggling, find groups, find fellowship, find recovery, find Celebrate Recovery. There's one 4 nights a week in this town. There's AA meetings, morning, noon, and night, every day in this town. So that would be the advice I give. Keep going, keep coming back.
That's all I have for you.
That's it. That was enough.